Chapter 3, Section 8 of The Greek View of Life by Goldsworthy Lowes Dickinson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Martin Geeson. Chapter 3, Section 8. The Greek View of Woman. In the preceding account, we have attempted to give some conception of the Greek ideal for the individual man. It is now time to remind ourselves that that ideal was only supposed to be proper to a small class, the class of soldier citizens. Artisans and slaves, as we have seen, had no participation in it. Neither, and that is our next point, had women. Nothing more profoundly distinguishes the Hellenic from the modern view of life than the estimate in which women were held by the Greeks. Their opinion on this point was partly the cause and partly the effect of that preponderance of the idea of the state on which we have already dwelt, and from which it followed naturally enough that marriage should be regarded primarily as a means of producing healthy and efficient citizens. This view is best illustrated by the institutions of such a state as Sparta, where, as we saw, the woman was specially trained for maternity, and connections outside the marriage tie were sanctioned by custom and opinion, if they were such as were likely to lead to healthy offspring. Further, it may be noted that in almost every state the exposure of deformed or sickly infants was encouraged by law, the child being thus regarded from the beginning as a member of the state rather than as a member of the family. The same view is reflected in the speculations of political philosophers. Plato, indeed, in his Republic, goes so far as to eliminate the family relation altogether. Not only is the whole connection between men and women to be regulated by the state, in respect both of the persons and of the limit of age within which they may associate, but the children, as soon as they are born, are to be carried off to a common nursery, there to be reared together, undistinguished by the mothers, who will suckle indifferently any infant that might happen to be assigned to them for the purpose. Here, as in other instances, Plato goes far beyond the limits set by the current sentiment of the Greeks, and in his later work is reluctantly constrained to abandon his scheme of community of wives and children. Yet even there he makes it compulsory on every man to marry between the ages of 30 and 35, under penalty of fine and civil disabilities. Plato, no doubt, as we have said, exaggerates the opinions of his time. But the view which he pushes to its extreme of the subordination of the family to the state was one, as we have already pointed out, which did predominate in Greece. It reappears in a soberer form in the treatise of Aristotle. He too would regulate by law both the age at which marriages should take place and the number of children that should be produced, and would have all deformed infants exposed. And here, no doubt, he is speaking in conformity, if not with the practice, at least with the feeling of Greece. The modern conception that the marriage relation is a matter of private concern, and that any individual has a right to wed whom and when he will, and to produce children at his own discretion, regardless of all considerations of health and decency, was one altogether alien to the Greeks. In theory at least, and to some extent in practice, as for example in the case of Sparta, they recognized that the production of children was a business of supreme import to the state, and that it was right and proper that it should be regulated by law, with a view to the advantage of the whole community. And if now we turn from considering the family in its relation to the state to regard it in its relation to the individual, we are struck once more by a divergence from the modern point of view, or rather from the view which is supposed to prevail, particularly by writers of fiction, at any rate in modern English life. In ancient Greece, so far as our knowledge goes, there was little or no romance connected with the marriage tie. Marriage was a means of producing legitimate children. That is how it is defined by Demosthenes, and we have no evidence that it was ever regarded as anything more. In Athens, we know that marriages were commonly arranged by the father, much as they are in modern France, on grounds of age, property, connection, and the like, and without any regard for the inclination of the parties concerned. And an interesting passage in Xenophon indicates a point of view quite consonant with this accepted practice. God, he says, ordained the institution of marriage, but on what grounds? Not in the least for the sake of the personal relation that might be established between the husband and wife, but for ends quite external and indifferent to any affection that might exist between them. First, for the perpetuation of the human race. Secondly, to raise up protectors for the father in his old age. Thirdly, to secure an appropriate division of labour, the man performing the outdoor work, the woman guarding and superintending at home, and each thus fulfilling duly the function for which they were designed by nature. This eminently prosaic way of conceiving the marriage relation is also, it would seem, eminently Greek, and it leads us to consider more particularly the opinion prevalent in Greece of the nature and duty of woman in general. Here the first point to be noticed is the wide difference of the view represented in the Homeric poems from that which meets us in the historic period. Readers of the Iliad and the Odyssey will find depicted there, amid all the barbarity of an age of rapine and war, relations between men and women so tender, faithful, and beautiful, that they may almost stand as universal types of the ultimate human ideal. Such, for example, is the relation between Odysseus and Penelope, the wife waiting year by year for the husband whose fate is unknown, wooed in vain by suitors who waste her substance and wear her life, nightly watering her bed with her tears for 20 weary years, till at last the wanderer returns, and at once her knees were loosened and her heart melted within her, and she fell a-weeping and ran straight towards him, and cast her hands about his neck and kissed his head. For even as the sight of the land is welcome to mariners, so welcome to her was the sight of her lord. and her white arms would never quite leave hold of his neck. Such again is the relation between Hector and Andromache, as described in the well-known scene of the Iliad, where the wife comes out with her babe to take leave of the husband on his way to battle. "It were better for me," she cries, "to go down to the grave if I lose thee. For never will any comfort be mine when once thou, even thou, hast met thy fate, but only sorrow. Thou art to me father and lady mother, yea, and brother, even as thou art my goodly husband. Come now, have pity and abide here upon the tower, lest thou make thy child an orphan, and thy wife a widow." Hector answers with the plea of honour. He cannot draw back, but he foresees defeat, and in his anticipation of the future, nothing is so bitter as the fate he fears for his wife. Yet doth the conquest of the Trojans hereafter not so much trouble me, neither Hecabe's own, neither King Priam's, neither my brethren's, the many and the brave that shall fall in the dust before their foemen, as doth thine anguish, in the day when some mail-clad Achaean shall lead thee weeping and rob thee of the light of freedom. But me in death may the heaped-up earth be covering, ere I hear thy crying, and thy carrying into captivity. But most striking of all the portraits of women to be found in Homer, and most typical of a frank and healthy relation between the sexes, is the account of Nausicaa given in the Odyssey. Ulysses, shipwrecked and naked, battered and covered with brine, surprises Nausicaa and her maidens as they are playing at ball on the shore. The attendants run away, but Nausicaa remains to hear what the stranger has to say. He asks her for shelter and clothing, and she grants the request with an exquisite courtesy and a freedom from all embarrassment, which becomes only the more marked and the more delightful when, as she sees him emerge from the bath, clothed and beautiful, she cannot restrain the exclamation, "Would that such a one might be called my husband, dwelling here, and that it might please him here to abide." About the whole scene there is a freshness and a fragrance as of early morning, and a tone so natural, free, and frank, that in the face of this rustic idyll, the later centuries sicken and faint, like candle-light in the splendour of the dawn. If we had only Homer to give us our ideas of the Greeks, we might conclude from such passages as these that they had a conception of woman and of her relation to man finer and nobler in some respects than that of modern times. But in fact the Homeric poems represent a civilization which had passed away before the opening of the period with which at present we are chiefly concerned. And in the interval, for reasons which we need not here attempt to state, a change had taken place in the whole way of regarding the female sex. So far, at any rate, as our authorities enable us to judge, woman, in the historic age, was conceived to be so inferior to man that he recognized in her no other end than to minister to his pleasure, or to become the mother of his children. Romance, and the higher companionship of intellect and spirit, do not appear, with certain notable exceptions, to have been commonly sought or found in this relation. Woman, in fact, was regarded as a means, not as an end, and was treated in a manner consonant with this view. Of this estimate many illustrations might be adduced from the writers of the 5th and 4th centuries. Plato, for example, classes together children, women, and servants, and states generally that there is no branch of human industry in which the female sex is not inferior to the male. Similarly, Aristotle insists again and again on the natural inferiority of woman, and illustrates it by such quaint observations as the following: "A man would be considered a coward who was only as brave as a brave woman, and a woman as a chatterbox who was only as modest as a good man." But the most striking example, perhaps, because the most unconscious, of this habitual way of regarding women, is to be found in the funeral oration put by Thucydides into the mouth of Pericles, where the speaker, after suggesting what consolation he can to the fathers of the slain, turns to the women with the brief but significant exhortation: "If I am to speak of womanly virtues to those of you who will henceforth be widows, let me sum them up in one short admonition. To a woman not to show more weakness than is natural to her sex is a great glory, and not to be talked about, for good or for evil, among men." The sentiments of the poets are less admissible as evidence, but some of them are so extreme that they may be adduced as a further indication of a point of view whose prevalence alone could render them even dramatically plausible. Such, for example, is the remark which Euripides puts into the mouth of his Medea: "Women are impotent for good, but clever contrivers of all evil." Or that of one of the characters of Menander: "A woman is necessarily an evil, and he is a lucky man who catches her in the mildest form." While the general Greek view of the dependence of woman on man is well expressed in the words of Aethra in the Suppliants of Euripides: "It is proper for women who are wise to let men act for them in everything." In accordance with this conception of the inferiority of the female sex, and partly as a cause, partly as an effect of it, we find that the position of the wife in ancient Greece was simply that of the domestic drudge. To stay at home and mind the house was her recognised ideal. "A free woman should be bounded by the street door," says one of the characters in Menander, and another writer discriminates as follows the functions of the two sexes: "War, politics, and public speaking are the sphere of man. That of woman is to keep house, to stay at home, and to receive and tend her husband." We are not surprised, therefore, to find that the symbol of woman is the tortoise, and in the following burlesque passage from Aristophanes we shall recognise, in spite of the touch of caricature, the genuine features of the Greek wife. Praxagora is recounting the merits and services of women. "They dip their wool in hot water, according to the ancient plan, all of them without exception, and never make the slightest innovation. They sit and cook, as of old. They carry upon their heads, as of old. They conduct the thesmophoriae, as of old. They wear out their husbands, as of old. They buy sweets, as of old. They take their wine neat, as of old." And that this was also the kind of ideal approved by their lords and masters, and that any attempt to pass beyond it was resented, is amusingly illustrated in the following extract from the same poet, where Lysistrata explains the growing indignation of the women at the bad conduct of affairs by the men, and the way in which their attempts to interfere were resented. The comments of the magistrate typify, of course, the man's point of view. "Oh, think of our old moderation and gentleness. Think how we bore with your pranks, and were still, all through the days of your former prognacity, all through the war that is over and spent. Not that, be sure, we approved of your policy. Never our griefs you allowed us to vent. Well we perceived your mistakes and mismanagement. Often at home on our housekeeping cares, often we heard of some foolish proposal you made for conducting the public affairs. Then we would question you mildly and pleasantly, inwardly grieving, but outwardly gay. 'Husband, how goes it abroad?' we would ask of him. 'What have ye done in assembly to day? What would ye write on the side of the treaty stone?' Husband says angrily, 'What's that to you? You hold your tongue.' And I held it accordingly." Stratulis. "That is a thing which I never would do." Magistrate. "Ma'am, if you hadn't, you'd soon have repented it." "Therefore I held it, and spake not a word. Soon of another tremendous absurdity, wilder and worse than the former, we heard. 'Husband,' I say with a tender solicitude, 'why have you passed such a foolish decree?' Viciously, moodily, glaring askance at me, 'Stick to your spinning, my mistress,' says he, 'else you will speedily find it the worse for you. War is the care and the business of men.'" Zeus, 'twas a worthy reply, and an excellent. "What, you unfortunate! Shall we not then, when we see you perplexed and incompetent, shall we not tender advice to the state?" The conception thus indicated in burlesque of the proper place of woman is expressed more seriously from the point of view of the average man in the Oikonomikos of Xenophon. Ischomachus, the hero of that work, with whom we have already made acquaintance, gives an account of his own wife, and of the way in which he had trained her. When he married her, he explains, she was not yet 15, and had been brought up with the utmost care, "that she might see, hear, and ask as little as possible." Her accomplishments were weaving, and a sufficient acquaintance with all that concerns the stomach, and her attitude towards her husband she expressed in the single phrase, "Everything rests with you. My duty, my mother said, is simply to be modest." Ischomachus proceeds to explain to her the place he expects her to fill. She is to suckle his children, to cook, and to superintend the house, and for this purpose God has given her special gifts, different from, but not necessarily inferior to those of man. Husband and wife naturally supply one another's deficiencies, and if the wife perform her function worthily, she may even make herself the ruling partner. And be sure that as she grows older, she will be held not less but more in honour, as the guardian of her children, and the stewardess of her husband's goods. In Xenophon's view, in fact, the inferiority of the woman almost disappears, and the sentiment approximates closely to that of Tennyson. Either sex alone is half itself, and in true marriage lies nor equal nor unequal, each fulfils defect in each. Such a conception, however, of the complementary relation of woman to man does not exclude a conviction of her essential inferiority. And this conviction, it can hardly be disputed, was a cardinal point in the Greek view of life. End of chapter 3, section 8. Recording by Martin Geeson in Haslemere, Surrey. Chapter 3, section 9 of the Greek View of Life by Goldsworthy Lowes Dickinson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Martin Geeson. Chapter 3, section 9. Protests against the common view of women. Nevertheless, there are not wanting indications, both in theory and practice, of a protest against it. In Sparta, as we have already noticed, girls, instead of being confined to the house, were brought up in the open air among the boys, trained in gymnastics, and accustomed to run and wrestle naked. And Plato, modelling his view upon this experience, makes no distinction of the sexes in his ideal republic. Women, he admits, are generally inferior to men, but they have similar, if lower, capacities and powers. There is no occupation or art for which they may not be fitted by nature and education, and he would therefore have them take their share in government and war, as well as in the various mechanical trades. None of the occupations, he says, which comprehend the ordering of a state, belong to woman as woman, nor yet to man as man. But natural gifts are to be found here and there in both sexes alike, and so far as her nature is concerned, the woman is admissible to all pursuits as well as the man, though in all of them the woman is weaker than the man. In adopting this attitude, Plato stands alone, not only among Greeks, but one might almost say among mankind, till we come to the latest views of the 19th century. But there is another Greek, the poet Euripides, who, without advancing any theory about the proper position of women, yet displays so intimate an understanding of their difficulties, and so warm and close a sympathy with their griefs, that some of his utterances may stand to all time as documents of the dumb and age-long protest of the weaker against the stronger sex. In illustration, we may cite the following lines from the Medea, applicable mutatis mutandis to how many generations of suffering wives. Of all things that have life and sense, we women are most wretched, for we are compelled to buy with gold a husband who is also, worst of all, the master of our person, and on his character, good or bad, our whole fate depends. For divorce is regarded as a disgrace to a woman, and she cannot repudiate her husband. Then, coming as she does into the midst of manners and customs strange to her, she would need the gift of divination, unless she has been taught at home to know how best to treat her bedfellow. And if we manage so well that our husband remains faithful to us and does not break away, we may think ourselves fortunate. If not, there is nothing for it but death. A man, when he is vexed at home, can go out and find relief among his friends or acquaintances, but we women have none to look to but him. They tell us we live a sheltered life at home, while they go to the wars, but that is nonsense. For I would rather go into battle thrice than bear a child once. Hitherto we have been speaking mainly of the position of the wife in Greece. It is necessary now to say a few words about that class of women who were called in the Greek tongue hetaerae, and who are by some supposed to have represented, intellectually at least, a higher level of culture than the other members of their sex. In exceptional cases this no doubt was the fact. Aspasia, for example, the mistress of Pericles, was famous for her powers of mind. According to Plato, she was an accomplished rhetorician, and the real composer of the celebrated funeral oration of Pericles. And Plutarch asserts that she was courted and admired by the statesmen and philosophers of Greece. But Aspasia cannot be taken as a type of the hetaerae of Greece. That these women, by the variety and freedom of their life, may and must have acquired certain qualities of character and mind that could hardly be developed in the seclusion of the Greek home, may readily be admitted. We know, for example, that they cultivated music and the power of conversation, and were welcome guests at supper parties. But we have no evidence that the relations which they formed rested as a rule on any but the simplest physical basis. The real distinction under this head between the Greek point of view and our own appears to lie rather in the frankness with which this whole class of relations was recognised by the Greeks. There were temples in honour of Aphrodite Pandemos, the goddess of illicit love, and festivals celebrated in her honour. Statues were erected of famous courtesans, of Phryne, for example, at Delphi, between two kings, and philosophers and statesmen lived with their mistresses openly, without any loss of public reputation. Every man, said the orator Demosthenes, requires besides his wife at least 2 mistresses. And this statement, made as a matter of course in open court, is perhaps the most curious illustration we possess of the distinction between the Greek civilization and our own, as regards not the fact itself, but the light in which it was viewed. End of chapter 3, section 9. Recording by Martin Geeson in Haslemere, Surrey. Chapter 3, section 10, part 1 of the Greek View of Life by Goldsworthy Lowes Dickinson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Martin Geeson. Chapter 3, section 10, Friendship, part 1. From what has been said about the Greek view of women, it might naturally have been supposed that there can have been little place in their life for all that we designate under the term romance. Personal affection, as we have seen, was not the basis of married life, and relations with hetaerae appear to have been, in this respect, no finer or higher than similar relations in our own times. Nevertheless, it would be a mistake to conclude from these conditions that the element of romance was absent from Greek life. The fact is simply that with them it took a different form, that of passionate friendship between men. Such friendships of course occur in all nations and at all times, but among the Greeks they were, we might say, an institution. Their ideal was the development and education of the younger by the older man, and in this view they were recognised and approved by custom and law as an important factor in the state. In Sparta, for example, it was the rule that every boy had attached to him some elder youth by whom he was constantly attended, admonished, and trained, and who shared in public estimation the praise and blame of his acts, so that it is even reported that on one occasion a Spartan boy having cried out in a fight, not he himself, but his friend was fined for the lapse of self-control. The custom of Sparta existed also in Crete. But the most remarkable instance of the deliberate dedication of this passion to political and military ends is that of the celebrated Theban band, a troop consisting exclusively of pairs of lovers, who marched and fought in battle side by side, and by their presence and example inspired one another to a courage so constant and high, that it is stated that they were never beaten till the battle at Chaeronea. And when Philip, after the fight, took a view of the slain, and came to the place where the 300 that fought his phalanx lay dead together, he wondered, and understanding that it was the band of lovers, he shed tears, and said, "Perish any man who suspects that these men either did or suffered anything that was base." Greek legend and history, in fact, resounds with the praises of friends. Achilles and Patroclus, Pylades and Orestes, Harmodius and Aristogeiton, Solon and Pisistratus, Socrates and Alcibiades, Epaminondas and Pelopidas. These are names that recall at once all that is highest in the achievement and all that is most romantic in the passion of Greece. For it was the prerogative of this form of love, in its finer manifestations, that it passed beyond persons to objective ends, linking emotion to action in a life of common danger and toil. Not only, nor primarily, the physical sense was touched, but mainly and in chief the imagination and intellect. The affection of Achilles for Patroclus is as intense as that of a lover for his mistress, but it has in addition a body and depth such as only years of common labour could impart. Achilles wept, remembering his dear comrade, nor did sleep that conquereth all take hold of him, but he kept turning himself to this side and to that, yearning for Patroclus' manhood and excellent valour, and all the toils he achieved with him, and the woes he bare, cleaving the battles of men and the grievous waves. As he thought thereon, he shed big tears, now lying on his side, now on his back, now on his face, and then anon he would arise upon his feet and roam wildly beside the beach of the salt sea. That is the ideal spirit of Greek comradeship, each supporting the other in his best efforts and aims, mind assisting mind, and hand, and the end of the love residing not in an easy satisfaction of itself, but in the development and perfecting of the souls in which it dwelt. Of such a love we have a record in the elegies of Theognis, in which the poet has embodied, for the benefit of Curnus, his friend, the ripe experience of an eventful life. The poems, for the most part, are didactic in character, consciously and deliberately aimed at the instruction and guidance of the man to whom they are addressed, but every now and again the passion breaks through which informs and inspires this virile intercourse, and in such a passage as the following gives us the key to this and to all the finer friendships of the Greeks. Lo, I have given thee wings, wherewith to fly over the boundless ocean and the earth. Yea, on the lips of many shalt thou lie, the comrade of their banquet and their mirth. Youths in their loveliness shall bid thee sound upon the silver flute's melodious breath, and when thou goest darkling underground, down to the lamentable house of death, oh, yet not then from honour shalt thou cease, but wander an imperishable name, Curnus, about the seas and shores of Greece, crossing from isle to isle the barren main. Horses thou shalt not need, but lightly ride, sped by the muses of the violet crown, and men to come, while earth and sun abide, who cherish song, shall cherish thy renown. Yea, I have given thee wings, and in return thou givest me the scorn with which I burn. It was his insistence on friendship as an incentive to a noble life that was the secret of the power of Socrates. Listen, for example, to the account which Plutarch gives of his influence upon the young Alcibiades. Alcibiades, listening now to language entirely free from every thought of unmanly fondness and silly displays of affection, finding himself with one who sought to lay open to him the deficiencies of his mind, and repress his vain and foolish arrogance, dropped like the craven cock his conquered wing. He esteemed these endeavours of Socrates as most truly a means which the gods made use of for the care and preservation of youth, and began to think meanly of himself, and to admire him, to be pleased with his kindness, and to stand in awe of his virtue. And unawares to himself there became formed in his mind that reflex image and reciprocation of love, or anteros, that Plato talks of. Though Socrates had many and powerful rivals, yet the natural good qualities of Alcibiades gave his affection the mastery. His words overcame him so much as to draw tears from his eyes and to disturb his very soul. Yet sometimes he would abandon himself to flatterers, when they proposed to him varieties of pleasure, and would desert Socrates, who would then pursue him as if he had been a fugitive slave. He despised every one else, and had no reverence or awe for any but him. The relation thus established may be further illustrated by the following graceful little anecdote. Socrates and Alcibiades were fellow soldiers at Potidaea, and shared the same tent. In a stiff engagement, both behaved with gallantry. At last Alcibiades fell wounded, and Socrates, standing over him, defended and finally saved him. For this he might fairly have claimed the customary prize of valour, but he insisted on resigning it to his friend as an incentive to his ambition for noble deeds. Another illustration of the power of this passion to evoke and stimulate courage is given in the story of Cleomachus, narrated by Plutarch. In a battle between the Chalcidians and the Eretrians, the cavalry of the former being hard pressed, Cleomachus was called upon to make a diversion. He turned to his friend and asked him if he intended to be a spectator of the struggle. The youth replied in the affirmative, and embracing his friend, with his own hands buckled on his helmet. Whereupon Cleomachus, charged with impetuosity, routed the foe, and died gloriously fighting. And thenceforth, says Plutarch, the Chalcidians, who had previously mistrusted such friendships, cultivated and honoured them more than any other people. End of chapter 3, section 10, part 1. Recording by Martin Geeson in Haslemere, Surrey. Chapter 3, Section 10, Part 2, of the Greek View of Life, by Goldsworthy Lowes Dickinson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Martin Geeson. Chapter 3, Section 10, Friendship, Part 2. So much indeed were the Greeks impressed with the manliness of this passion, with its power to prompt to high thought and heroic action, that some of the best of them set the love of man for man far above that of man for woman. The one, they maintained, was primarily of the spirit, the other primarily of the flesh, the one bent upon shaping to the type of all manly excellence both the body and the soul of the beloved, the other upon a passing pleasure of the senses. And they noted that among the barbarians who were subject to tyrants, this passion was discouraged, along with gymnastics and philosophy, because it was felt by their masters that it would be fatal to their power. So essentially was it the prerogative of freedom, so incompatible with the nature and the status of a slave. It is in the works of Plato that this view is most completely and exquisitely set forth. To him, love is the beginning of all wisdom, and among all the forms of love, that one in chief which is conceived by one man for another, of which the main operation and end is in the spirit, and which leads on and out from the passion for a particular body and soul to an enthusiasm for that highest beauty, wisdom, and excellence, of which the most perfect mortal forms are but a faint and inadequate reflection. Such a love is the initiation into the higher life, the spring at once of virtue, of philosophy, and of religion. Always operative in practice in Greek life, it was not invented, but interpreted by Plato. The philosopher merely gave an ideal expression to what was stirring in the heart of every generous youth. And the passage which we have selected for quotation may be taken as representative not only of the personality of Plato, but of the higher aspect of a characteristic phase of Greek civilization. And now, taking my leave of you, I will rehearse a tale of love, which I heard from Diotima of Mantinea, a woman wise in this and in many other kinds of knowledge. She was my instructress in the art of love, and I shall repeat to you what she said to me. On the birthday of Aphrodite there was a feast of the gods, at which the god Poros, or Plenty, who is the son of Metis, or Discretion, was one of the guests. When the feast was over, Penia, or Poverty, as the manner is on such occasions, came about the doors to beg. Now Plenty, who was the worse for nectar, there was no wine in those days, went into the garden of Zeus, and fell into a heavy sleep. And Poverty, considering her own straitened circumstances, plotted to have a child by him, and accordingly she lay down at his side, and conceived Love, who, partly because he is naturally a lover of the beautiful, and because Aphrodite is herself beautiful, and also because he was born on her birthday, is her follower and attendant. And as his parentage is, so also are his fortunes. In the first place, he is always poor, and anything but tender and fair, as the many imagine him. And he is rough and squalid, and has no shoes, nor a house to dwell in. On the bare earth exposed he lies, under the open heaven, in the streets or at the doors of houses, taking his rest. And like his mother, he is always in distress. Like his father too, whom he also partly resembles, he is always plotting against the fair and good. He is bold, enterprising, strong, a mighty hunter, always weaving some intrigue or other, keen in the pursuit of wisdom, fertile in resources, a philosopher at all times, terrible as an enchanter, sorcerer, sophist. He is by nature neither mortal nor immortal, but alive and flourishing at one moment, when he is in plenty, and dead at another moment, and again alive by reason of his father's nature. But that which is always flowing in is always flowing out, and so he is never in want and never in wealth. And further, he is in a mean between ignorance and knowledge. The truth of the matter is this: no god is a philosopher or seeker after wisdom, neither do the ignorant seek after wisdom. For herein is the evil of ignorance, that he who is neither good nor wise is nevertheless satisfied with himself. He has no desire for that of which he feels no want.
But who then, Diotima, I said, are the lovers of wisdom, if they are neither the wise nor the foolish?
A child may answer that question, she replied. They are those who are in a mean between the two. Love is one of them. For wisdom is a most beautiful thing, and love is of the beautiful. And therefore love is also a philosopher or lover of wisdom, and being a lover of wisdom is in a mean between the wise and the ignorant. And of this too his birth is the cause. For his father is wealthy and wise, and his mother poor and foolish. Such, my dear Socrates, is the nature of the spirit love.
I said, O thou stranger woman, thou sayest well. But assuming love to be such as you say, what is the use of him to man?
That, Socrates, she replied, I will attempt to unfold. Of his nature and birth I have already spoken, and you acknowledge that love is of the beautiful. But some one will say, of the beautiful in what, Socrates and Diotima? Or let me put the question more clearly, and ask, when a man loves the beautiful, what does he desire?
I answered her, that the beautiful may be his.
Still, she said, the answer suggests a further question. What is given by the possession of beauty?
To what you have asked, I said, I have no answer ready.
Then, she said, let me put the word good in the place of beautiful, and repeat the question once more. If he who loves, loves the good, what is it then that he loves?
The possession of the good, I said.
And what does he gain who possesses the good?
Happiness, I replied. There is less difficulty in answering that question.
Yes, she said, the happy are made happy by the acquisition of good things. Nor is there any need to ask why a man desires happiness. The answer is already final.
You are right, I said.
And is this wish and this desire common to all? And do all men always desire their own good? Or only some men? What say you?
All men, I replied. The desire is common to all.
Then, she said, the simple truth is that men love the good.
Yes, I said.
To which must be added that they love the possession of the good.
That must be added too.
Then love, she said, may be described generally as the love of the everlasting possession of the good.
That is most true.
Then if this be the nature of love, can you tell me further, she said, what is the manner of the pursuit? What are they doing who show all this eagerness and heat, which is called love? And what is the object which they have in view? Answer me.
Nay, Diotima, I replied, if I had known, I should not have wondered at your wisdom. Neither should I have come to learn from you about this very matter.
Well, she said, I will teach you. The object which they have in view is birth in beauty, whether of body or soul.
I do not understand you, I said. The oracle requires an explanation.
I will make my meaning clearer, she replied. I mean to say that all men are bringing to the birth in their bodies and in their souls. There is a certain age at which human nature is desirous of procreation. Procreation which must be in beauty and not in deformity. And this procreation is the union of a man and woman, and is a divine thing. For conception and generation are an immortal principle in the mortal creature, and in the inharmonious they can never be. But the deformed is always inharmonious with the divine, and the beautiful harmonious. Beauty, then, is the destiny or goddess of parturition who presides at birth. And therefore, when approaching beauty, the conceiving power is propitious, and diffusive, and benign, and begets and bears fruit. At the sight of ugliness, she frowns and contracts, and has a sense of pain, and turns away, and shrivels up, and not without a pang refrains from conception. And this is the reason why, when the hour of conception arrives, and the teeming nature is full, there is such a flutter and ecstasy about beauty, whose approach is the alleviation of the pain of travail. For love, Socrates, is not, as you imagine, the love of the beautiful only.
What then?
The love of generation and of birth in beauty.
Yes, I said.
Yes, indeed, she replied.
But why of generation?
Because to the mortal creature, generation is a sort of eternity and immortality, she replied. And if, as has been already admitted, love is of the everlasting possession of the good, all men will necessarily desire immortality together with good, wherefore love is of immortality. End of chapter 3, section 10, part 2. Recording by Martin Geeson in Haslemere, Surrey. Chapter 3, section 10, part 3 of the Greek View of Life by Goldsworthy Lowes Dickinson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Martin Geeson. Chapter 3, section 10, Friendship, part 3. I was astonished at her words, and said, "Is this really true, O thou wise Diotima?" And she answered with all the authority of an accomplished sophist, "Of that, Socrates, you may be assured. Think only of the ambition of men, and you will wonder at the senselessness of their ways, unless you consider how they are stirred by the love of an immortality of fame. They are ready to run all risks, greater far than they would have run for their children, and to spend money and undergo any sort of toil, and even to die, for the sake of leaving behind them a name which shall be eternal. Do you imagine that Alcestis would have died to save Admetus, or Achilles to avenge Patroclus, or your own Codrus in order to preserve the kingdom for his sons, if they had not imagined that the memory of their virtues, which still survives among us, would be immortal? Nay," she said, "I am persuaded that all men do all things, and the better they are, the more they do them, in hope of the glorious fame of immortal virtue, for they desire the immortal. Those who are pregnant in the body only betake themselves to women and beget children. This is the character of their love. Their offspring, as they hope, will preserve their memory, and give them the blessedness and immortality which they desire in the future. But souls which are pregnant, for there certainly are men who are more creative in their souls than in their bodies, conceive that which is proper for the soul to conceive or contain. And what are these conceptions? Wisdom and virtue in general. And such creators are poets and all artists who are deserving of the name inventor. But the greatest and fairest sort of wisdom by far is that which is concerned with the ordering of states and families, and which is called temperance and justice. And he who in youth has the seed of these implanted in him, and is himself inspired, when he comes to maturity, desires to beget and generate. He wanders about, seeking beauty, that he may beget offspring. For in deformity he will beget nothing, and naturally embraces the beautiful rather than the deformed body. Above all, when he finds a fair and noble and well-nurtured soul, he embraces the two in one person, and to such a one he is full of speech about virtue and the nature and pursuits of a good man. And he tries to educate him. And at the touch of the beautiful, which is ever present to his memory, even when absent, he brings forth that which he had conceived long before, and in company with him tends that which he brings forth. and they are married by a far nearer tie, and have a closer friendship than those who beget mortal children. For the children who are their common offspring are fairer and more immortal. Who, when he thinks of Homer and Hesiod and other great poets, would not rather have their children than ordinary ones? Who would not emulate them in the creation of children such as theirs, which have preserved their memory and given them everlasting glory? Or who would not have such children as Lycurgus left behind him, to be the savours not only of Lacedaemon, but of Hellas, as one may say? There is Solon too, who is the revered father of Athenian laws, and many others there are in many other places, both among Hellenes and barbarians, who have given to the world many noble works, and have been the parents of virtue of every kind. And many temples have been raised in their honour, for the sake of children such as theirs, which were never raised in honour of any one for the sake of his mortal children. These are the lesser mysteries of love, into which even you, Socrates, may enter. To the greater and more hidden ones, which are the crown of these, and to which, if you pursue them in a right spirit, they will lead, I know not whether you will be able to attain. But I will do my utmost to inform you, and do you follow if you can. For he who would proceed aright in this matter should begin in youth to visit beautiful forms. And first, if he be guided by his instructor aright, to love one such form only. Out of that he should create fair thoughts, and soon he will of himself perceive that the beauty of one form is akin to the beauty of another. And then, if beauty of form in general is his pursuit, how foolish would he be not to recognise that the beauty in every form is one and the same. And when he perceives this, he will abate his violent love of the one, which he will despise and deem a small thing, and will become a lover of all beautiful forms. In the next stage, he will consider that the beauty of the mind is more honourable than the outward form. So that if a virtuous soul have but a little comeliness, he will be content to love and tend him, and will search out and bring to the birth thoughts which may improve the young, until he is compelled to contemplate and see the beauty of institutions and laws, and to understand that the beauty of them all is of one family, and that personal beauty is a trifle. And after laws and institutions, he will go on to the sciences, that he may see their beauty, being not like a servant in love with the beauty of one youth or man or institution, himself a slave, mean and narrow-minded, but drawing towards and contemplating the vast sea of beauty, he will create many fair and noble thoughts and notions in boundless love of wisdom, until on that store he grows and waxes strong, and at last the vision is revealed to him of a single science, which is the science of beauty everywhere. To this I will proceed. Please to give me your very best attention. He who has been instructed thus far in the things of love, and who has learned to see the beautiful in due order and succession, when he comes toward the end, will suddenly perceive a nature of wondrous beauty. And this, Socrates, is the final cause of all our former toils, a nature which in the first place is everlasting, not growing and decaying, or waxing and waning; secondly, not fair in one point of view and foul in another, or at one time, or in one relation, or in one place fair, at another time, or in another relation, or at another place foul, as if fair to some and foul to others, or in the likeness of a face, or hands, or any other part of the bodily frame, or in any form of speech or knowledge, or existing in any other being, as for example in an animal, or in heaven, or in earth, or in any other place, but beauty absolute, separate, simple, and everlasting, which without diminution and without increase or any change is imparted to the ever-growing and perishing beauties of all other things. He who from these ascending under the influence of true love begins to perceive that beauty is not far from the end. And the true order of going, or being led by another, to the things of love, is to begin from the beauties of earth and mount upwards for the sake of that other beauty, using these as steps only, and from one going on to two, and from two to all fair forms, and from fair forms to fair practices, and from fair practices to fair notions, until from fair notions he arrives at the notion of absolute beauty, and at last knows what the essence of beauty is. This, my dear Socrates, said the stranger of Mantinea, is that life above all others which man should live, in the contemplation of beauty absolute, a beauty which if you once beheld, you would see not to be after the measure of gold, and garments, and fair boys and youths, whose presence now entrances you, and you and many a one would be content to live seeing them only, and conversing with them without meat or drink, if that were possible. You only want to look at them and to be with them. But what if man had eyes to see the true beauty, the divine beauty, I mean, pure and clear and unalloyed, not clogged with the pollutions of mortality and all the colours and vanities of human life, thither looking and holding converse with the true beauty, simple and divine. Remember how in that communion only, beholding beauty with the eye of the mind, he will be enabled to bring forth not images of beauty, but realities. For he has hold not of an image, but of a reality. And bringing forth and nourishing true virtue to become the friend of God and be immortal, if mortal man may. Would that be an ignoble life?
Such, Phaedrus, and I speak not only to you, but to all of you, were the words of Diotima, and I am persuaded of their truth. And being persuaded of them, I try to persuade others, that in the attainment of this end, human nature will not easily find a helper better than love. And therefore also I say that every man ought to honour him as I myself honour him, and walk in his ways, and exhort others to do the same, and praise the power and spirit of love according to the measure of my ability, now and ever. I have thought it worth while to quote this passage, in spite of its length, partly for the sake of its own intrinsic beauty, partly because no account of the Greek view of life could be complete which did not insist upon the prominence in their civilization of the passion of friendship, and its capacity of being turned to the noblest uses. That there was another side to the matter goes without saying. This passion, like any other, has its depths as well as its heights, and the ideal of friendship conceived by Plato was as remote, perhaps, from the experience of the average man as Dante's presentation of the love between man and woman. Still, the fact remains that it was friendship of this kind that supplied to the Greek that element of romance which plays so large a part in modern life, and it is to this, and not to the relations between men and women, that we must look for the highest reaches of their emotional experience. End of chapter 3, section 10. Recording by Martin Geeson in Haslemere, Surrey. Chapter 3, section 11 of the Greek View of Life by Goldsworthy Lowes Dickinson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Martin Geeson. Chapter 3, section 11. Summary. If now we turn back to take a general view of the points that have been treated in the present chapter, we shall notice, in the first place, that the ideal of the Greeks was the direct and natural outcome of the conditions of their life. It was not something beyond and above the experience of the class to which it applied, but rather was the formula of that experience itself. In philosophical phrase, it was immanent, not transcendent. Because there really was a class of soldier citizens free from the necessity of mechanical toil, possessed of competence and leisure, and devoting these advantages willingly to the service of the state, therefore their ideal of conduct took the form we have described. It was the ideal of a privileged class, and postulated for its realisation not only a strenuous endeavour on the part of the individual, but also certain adventitious gifts of fortune, such as health, wealth, and family connections. These were conditions that actually obtained among members of the class concerned, so that the ideal in question was not a mere abstract ought, but an expression of what, approximately at least, was realised in fact. But this, which was the strength of the ideal of the Greeks, was also its limitation. Their ethical system rested not only on universal facts of human nature, but also on a particular and transitory social arrangement. When, therefore, the city-state,
with its sharp antithesis of classes, began to decline, the ideal of the soldier citizen declined also. The conditions of its realisation no longer existed, and ethical conceptions passed into a new phase. In the first place, the ideal of conduct was extended so as to apply to man as man, instead of to a particular class in a particular form of state. And in the second place, as a corollary of this, those external goods of fortune which were the privilege of the few could no longer be assumed as conditions of an ideal which was supposed to apply to all. Consequently, the new ideal was conceived as wholly internal. To be virtuous was to act under the control of the universal reason which was supposed to dwell in man as man, and such action was independent of all the gifts of chance. It was as open to a slave as to a freeman, to an artisan as to a soldier or a statesman. The changes and chances of this mortal life were indifferent to the virtuous man. On the rack as on the throne, he was lord of himself and free. This conception of the Stoics broke down the limitation of the Greek ideal by extending the possibility of virtue to all mankind. But at the same time it destroyed its sanity and balance. For it was precisely because of its limitation that the ideal of the Greeks was, approximately at least, an account of what was, and not merely of what ought to be. A man possessed of wealth and friends, of leisure, health and culture, really could and did achieve the end at which he was aiming. But the conception of one who, without any such advantages, on the contrary with positive disadvantages, poor, sickly, and a slave perhaps, or even in prison or on the rack, should nevertheless retain unimpaired the dignity of manhood and the freedom of his own soul. Such a conception, if it is not chimerical, is at any rate so remote from common experience that it is not capable of serving as a really practical ideal for ordinary life. But an ideal so remote that its realisation is despaired of is as good as none. And the conception of the Stoics, if it was more comprehensive than that of Aristotle, was also less practical and real. By virtue, nevertheless, of this comprehensiveness, the Stoic ideal is more akin to modern tendencies than that of the soldier citizen in the city-state. To provide for the excellence of a privileged class at the expense of the rest of the community is becoming to us increasingly impossible in fact and intolerable in idea. But while admitting this, we cannot but note that the Greeks, at whatever cost, did actually achieve a development of the individual more high and more complete than has been even approached by any other age. Whether it will ever be possible, under totally different conditions, to realise once more that balance of body and soul, that sanity of ethical intuition, that frank recognition of the whole range of our complex human nature, with a view to its harmonious organisation under the control of a lucid reason, whether it will ever be possible again to realise this ideal, and that not only in the members of a privileged class, but in the whole body of the state, is a question too problematical to be raised with advantage in this place. But it is impossible not to perceive that with the decline of the Greek city-state something passed from the world which it can never cease to regret, and the recovery of which, if it might be, in some perfect form, must be the goal of its highest practical endeavours. Immense, no doubt, is the significance of the centuries that have intervened, but it is a significance of preparation, and when we look beyond the means to the wished-for end, limiting our conceptions to the actual possibilities of life on earth, it is among the Greeks that we seek the record of the highest achievement of the past, and the hope of the highest possibilities of the future. End of chapter 3. The Greek View of the Individual. Recording by Martin Geeson in Haslemere, Surrey. Chapter 4, Section 1 of the Greek View of Life by Goldsworthy Lowes Dickinson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Martin Geeson. Chapter 4, The Greek View of Art. Section 1, Greek Art, an Expression of National Life. In approaching the subject of the art of the Greeks, we come to what, more plausibly than any other, may be regarded as the central point of their scheme of life. We have already noticed, in dealing with other topics, how constantly the aesthetic point of view emerges and predominates in matters with which, in the modern way of looking at things, it appears to have no direct and natural connection. We saw, for example, how inseparable in their religion was the element of ritual and ceremony from that of idea, how in their ethical conceptions the primary notion was that of beauty, how they aimed throughout at a perfect balance of body and soul, and more generally in every department at an expression of the inner by the outer, so complete and perfect that the conception of a separation of the two became almost as impossible to their thought as it would have been unpleasing and discordant to their feeling. Now such a point of view is in fact that of art, and philosophers of history have been amply justified in characterising the whole Greek epoch as preeminently that of beauty. But if this be a true way of regarding the matter, we should expect to find that art and beauty had for the Greeks a very wide and complex significance. There is a view of art, and it is one that appears to be prevalent in our own time, which sets it altogether outside the general trend of national life and ideas, which asserts that it has no connection with ethics, religion, politics, or any of the general conceptions which regulate action and thought, that its end is in itself and is simply beauty, and that in beauty there is no distinction of high or low, no preference of one kind above another. Art, thus conceived, is in the first place purely subjective in character. The artist alone is the standard, and any phase or mood of his, however exceptional, personal, and transitory,
is competent to produce a work of art as satisfying and as great as one whose inspiration was drawn from a nation's life, reflecting its highest moments and its most universal aspirations and ideals. So that, for example, a butterfly drawn by Mr. Whistler would rank as high, say, as the Parthenon. And in the second place, in this view of art, the subject is a matter of absolute indifference. The standards of ordinary life, ethical or other, do not apply. There is no better or worse, but only a more or less beautiful. And the representation of a music hall stage or a public house bar may be as great and perfect a work of art as the Venus of Milo or the Madonna of Raphael. This theory, which arises naturally and perhaps inevitably in an age where national life has degenerated into materialism and squalor, and the artist feels himself a stranger in a world of Philistines, we need not here pause to examine and criticise. It has been mentioned merely to illustrate by contrast the Greek view, which was diametrically opposed to this, and valued art in proportion as it represented in perfect form the highest and most comprehensive aspects of the national ideal. To say this is not, of course, to say that the Greek conception of art was didactic. For the word didactic, when applied to art, has usually the implication that the excellence of the moral is the only point to be considered, and that if that is good, the work itself must be good. This idea does indeed occur in Greek thought. We find it, for example, paradoxically enough, in so great an artist as Plato. But if it had been the one which really determined their production, there would have been no occasion to write this chapter, for there would have been no Greek art to write about. The truer account of the impulse that urged them to create is that given also by Plato in an earlier and more impassioned work, in which he describes it as a madness of those who are possessed by the Muses, which enters into a delicate and virgin soul, and there inspiring frenzy, awakens lyrical and other numbers, with these adorning the myriad actions of ancient heroes for the instruction of posterity. But he who, having no touch of the Muses' madness in his soul, comes to the door and thinks that he will get into the temple by the help of art, he, I say, and his poetry are not admitted. The sane man is nowhere at all when he enters into rivalry with the madman. The presupposition, in fact, of all that can be said about the Greek view of art is that primarily and to begin with they were by nature artists. Judged simply by the aesthetic standard, without any consideration of subject matter at all, or any reference to intellectual or ethical ideals, they created works of art more purely beautiful than those of any other age or people. Their mere household crockery, their common pots and pans, are cast in shapes so exquisitely graceful, and painted in designs so admirably drawn and composed, that any one of them has a higher artistic value than the whole contents of the Royal Academy. and the little clay figures they used as we do china ornaments put to shame the most ambitious efforts of modern sculpture. Who, for example, would not rather look at a Tanagra statuette than at the equestrian statue of the Duke of Wellington? The Greeks, in fact, quite apart from any theories they may have held, were artists through and through, and that is a fact we must carry with us through the whole of our discussion. End of chapter 4, section 1. Recording by Martin Geeson in Haslemere, Surrey. Chapter 4, section 2 of the Greek View of Life by Goldsworthy Lowes Dickinson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Martin Geeson. Chapter 4, section 2. Identification of the aesthetic and ethical points of view. But on the other hand, it seems to be clear from all that we can learn that their habitual way of regarding works of art was not to judge them simply and exclusively by their aesthetic value. On the contrary, in criticising two works otherwise equally beautiful, they would give a higher place to the one or the other for its ethical or quasi-ethical qualities. This indeed is what we should expect from the comprehensive sense which, as we have seen, attached in their tongue to the word which we render beautiful. The aesthetic and ethical spheres, in fact, were never sharply distinguished by the Greeks, and it follows that as on the one hand their conception of the good was identified with that of the beautiful, so on the other hand their conception of the beautiful was identified with that of the good. Thus the most beautiful work of art, in the Greek sense of the term, was that which made the finest and most harmonious appeal, not only to the physical, but to the moral sense, and while communicating the highest and most perfect pleasure to the eye or the ear, had also the power to touch and inform the soul with the grace which was her moral excellence. Of this really characteristic Greek conception, this fusion, so instinctive as to be almost unconscious, of the aesthetic and ethical points of view, no better illustration could be given than the following passage from the Republic of Plato, where the philosopher is describing the effect of beautiful works of art, and especially of music, on the moral and intellectual character of his imaginary citizens. We would not have our guardians grow up amid images of moral deformity, as in some noxious pasture, and there browse and feed upon many a baneful herb and flower, day by day, little by little, until they silently gather a festering mass of corruption in their own soul. Let our artists rather be those who are gifted to discern the true nature of the beautiful and graceful. Then will our youth dwell in a land of health, amid fair sights and sounds, and receive the good in everything. And beauty, the effluence of fair works, shall flow into the eye and ear like a health-giving breeze from a purer region, and insensibly draw the soul from earliest years into likeness and sympathy with the beauty of reason. "There can be no nobler training than that," he replied. "And therefore," I said, "Glaucon, musical training is a more potent instrument than any other, because rhythm and harmony find their way into the inward places of the soul, on which they mightily fasten, imparting grace, and making the soul of him who is rightly educated graceful, or of him who is ill educated ungraceful, and also because he who has received this true education of the inner being will most shrewdly perceive omissions or faults in art and nature, and with a true taste, while he praises and rejoices over, and receives into his soul the good, and becomes noble and good, he will justly blame and hate the bad, now in the days of his youth, even before he is able to know the reason why. And when the reason comes, he will recognize and salute the friend with whom his education has made him long familiar." This fusion of the ideas of the beautiful and the good is the central point in the Greek theory of art, and it enables us to understand how it was that they conceived art to be educational. Its end, in their view, was not only pleasure, though pleasure was essential to it, but also, and just as much, edification. Plato, indeed, here again exaggerating the current view, puts the edification above the pleasure. He criticizes Homer as he might criticize a moral philosopher, pointing out the inadequacy, from an ethical point of view, of his conception of heaven and of the gods, and dismissing as injurious and of bad example to youthful citizens the whole tissue of passionate human feeling, the irrepressible outbursts of anger and grief and fear, by virtue of which alone the Iliad and the Odyssey are immortal poems instead of ethical tracts. And finally, with a half reluctant assent to the course of his own argument, he excludes the poets altogether from his ideal republic, on the ground that they encourage their hearers in that indulgence of emotion which it is the object of every virtuous man to repress. The conclusion of Plato, by his own admission, was half paradoxical, and it certainly never recommended itself to such a nation of artists as the Greeks. But it illustrates, nevertheless, the general bent of their views of art, that tendency to the identification of the beautiful and the good, which, while it was never pushed so far as to choke art with didactics, for Plato himself, even against his own will, is a poet, yet served to create a standard of taste which was ethical as much as aesthetic, and made the judgment of beauty also a judgment of moral worth. Quite in accordance with this view, we find that the central aim of all Greek art is the representation of human character and human ideals, the interpretation of nature for its own sake, in the narrower sense in which nature is opposed to man, is a modern and romantic development that would have been unintelligible to a Greek. Not that the Greeks were without a sense of what we call the beauties of nature, but that they treat them habitually, not as the centre of interest, but as the background to human activity.
The most beautiful descriptions of nature to be found in Greek poetry occur, incidentally only, in the choral odes introduced into their dramas, and among all their pictures of which we have any record, there is not one that answers to the description of a landscape. The subject is always mythological or historical, and the representation of nature merely a setting for the main theme. And on the other hand, the art for which the Greeks are most famous, and in which they have admittedly excelled all other peoples, is that art of sculpture, whose special function it is not only to represent, but to idealize the human form, and which is peculiarly adapted to embody for the sense not only physical but ethical types. And more remarkable still, as we shall have occasion to observe later, the very art which modern men regard as the most devoid of all intellectual content, the most incommensurable with any standard except that of pure beauty, I refer of course to the art of music, was invested by the Greeks with a definite moral content, and worked into their general theory of art as a direct interpretation of human life. The excellence of man, in short, directly or indirectly, was the point about which Greek art turned. That excellence was at once aesthetic and ethical, and the representation of what was beautiful involved also the representation of what was good. This point we will now proceed to illustrate more in detail in connection with the various special branches of art. End of chapter 4, section 2. Recording by Martin Geeson in Haslemere, Surrey. Chapter 4, section 3 of the Greek View of Life by Goldsworthy Lowes Dickinson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Martin Geeson. Chapter 4, section 3. Sculpture and Painting. Let us take first the plastic arts, sculpture and painting, and to bring into clear relief the Greek point of view, let us contrast with it that of the modern impressionist. To the impressionist, a picture is simply an arrangement of colour and line. The subject represented is nothing, the treatment everything. It would be better on the whole not even to know what objects are depicted, and to judge the picture by a comparison with the objects, or to consider what is the worth of the objects in themselves, or what we might think of them if we came across them in the connections of ordinary life, is simply to misconceive the whole meaning of a picture. For the artist and for the man who understands art, all scales and standards disappear, except that of the purely aesthetic beauty which consists in harmony of line and tone. The most perfect human form has no more value than a splash of mud, or rather both mud and human form disappear as irrelevant, and all that is left for judgment is the arrangement of colour and form originally suggested by those accidental and indifferent phenomena. In the Greek view, on the other hand, though we certainly cannot say that the subject was everything and the treatment nothing, for that would be merely the annihilation of art, yet we may assert that, granted the treatment, granted that the work was beautiful, the first and indispensable requirement, its worth was determined by the character of the subject. Sculpture and painting, in fact, to the Greeks, were not merely a medium of aesthetic pleasure. They were ways of expressing and interpreting national life. As such, they were subordinated to religion. The primary end of sculpture was to make statues of the gods and heroes. The primary end of painting was to represent mythological scenes, and in either case the purely aesthetic pleasure was also a means to a religious experience. Let us take, for example, the statue of Zeus at Olympia, the most famous of the works of Phidias. This colossal figure of ivory and gold was doubtless, according to all the testimony we possess, from a merely aesthetic point of view, among the most consummate creations of human genius. But what was the main aim of the artist who made it? What the main effect on the spectator? The artist had designed, and the spectator seemed to behold, a concrete image of that Homeric Zeus who was the centre of his religious consciousness. The Zeus who nodded his dark brow, and the ambrosial locks waved from the king's immortal head, and he made great Olympus quake. Those who approach the temple, says Lucian, do not conceive that they see ivory from the Indies, or gold from the mines of Thrace. No, but the very son of Cronos and Rhea, transported by Phidias to earth, and set to watch over the lonely plain of Pisa. He was, says Dion Chrysostom, the type of that unattained ideal, Hellas come to unity with herself, in expression at once mild and awful, as befits the giver of life and all good gifts, the common father, saviour and guardian of men, dignified as a king, tender as a father, awful as giver of laws, kind as protector of suppliants and friends, simple and great as giver of increase and wealth, revealing, in a word, in form and countenance, the whole array of gifts and qualities proper to his supreme divinity. The description is characteristic of the whole aim of Greek sculpture, the representation not only of beauty, but of character; not only of character, but of character idealized. The statues of the various gods derive their distinguishing individuality not merely from their association with conventional symbols, but from a concrete reproduction, in features, expression, drapery, pose, of the ethical and intellectual qualities for which they stand. An Apollo differs in type from a Zeus, an Athene from a Demeter, and in every case the artist works from an intellectual conception, bent not simply on a graceful harmony of lines, but on the representation of a character at once definite and ideal. Primarily, then, Greek sculpture was an expression of the national religion, and therefore also of the national life. For, as we saw, the cult of the gods was the centre not only of the religious but of the political consciousness of Greece, and an art which was born and flourished in the temple and the sacred grove naturally became the exponent of the ideal aspect of the state. It was thus, for example, that the Parthenon at Athens was at once the centre of the worship of Athene and a symbol of the corporate life over which she presided. The statue of the goddess having, as its appropriate complement, the frieze over which the spirit of the city moved in stone. And thus, too, the statues of the victors at the Olympian Games were dedicated in the sacred precinct, as a memorial of what was not only an athletic meeting, but also at once a centre of Hellenic unity and the most consummate expression of that aspect of their culture which contributed at least as much to their aesthetic as to their physical perfection. Sculpture, in fact, throughout was subordinated to religion, and through religion to national life. And it was from this that it derived its ideal and intellectual character. And so far as our authorities enable us to judge, the same is true of painting. The great pictures of which we have descriptions were painted to adorn temples and public buildings, and represented either mythological or national themes. Such, for example, was the great work of Polygnotus at Delphi, in which was depicted on the one hand the sack of Troy, on the other the descent of Odysseus into Hades, and such his representation of the battle of Marathon in the painted porch that led to the Acropolis of Athens. And even the vase paintings, of which we have innumerable examples, and which are mere decorations of common domestic utensils, have often enough some story of gods and heroes for their theme, whereby, over and above their purely aesthetic value, they made their appeal to the general religious consciousness of Greece. Painting, like sculpture, had its end in a sense outside itself, and from this very fact derived its peculiar dignity, simplicity, and power. From this account of the plastic art of the Greeks, it follows as a simple corollary that their aim was not merely to reproduce, but to transcend nature. For their subject was gods and heroes and gods were superior to men. Of this idealizing tendency we have in sculpture evidence enough in the many examples which have been preserved to us. And with regard to painting, there is curious literary testimony to the same effect. Aristotle, for example, remarks that even if it is impossible that men should be as Zeuxis painted them, yet it is better that he should paint them so, for the example ought to excel that for which it is an example. And in an imaginary conversation recorded between Socrates and Parrhasius, the artist admits without any hesitation that more pleasure is to be derived from pictures of men who are morally good than from those of men who are morally bad. In the Greek view, in fact, as we saw, physical and moral excellence went together, and it was excellence they sought to depict in their art. Not merely aesthetic beauty, though that was a necessary presupposition, but on the top of that, ideal types of character representative of their conception of the hero and the god. Art, in a word, was subordinate to the ethical ideal, or rather the ethical and aesthetic ideals were not yet dissociated. and the greatest artists the world has ever known worked deliberately under the direction and inspiration of the ideas that controlled and determined the life of their time. End of chapter 4, section 3. Recording by Martin Geeson in Haslemere, Surrey. Chapter 4, section 4 of the Greek View of Life by Goldsworthy Lowes Dickinson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Martin Geeson. Chapter 4, section 4. Music and the Dance. Turning now from the plastic arts to that other group which the Greeks classed together under the name of music, namely music in the narrower sense, dancing and poetry, we find still more clearly emphasized and more elaborately worked out the subordination of aesthetic to ethical and religious ends. Music, in fact, as they used the term, was the centre of Greek education, and its moral character thus became a matter of primary importance. By it were formed, it was supposed, the mind and temper of the citizens, and so the whole constitution of the state. The introduction of a new kind of music, says Plato, must be shunned as imperilling the whole state, since styles of music are never disturbed without affecting the most important political institutions. The new style, he goes on, gradually gaining a lodgment, quietly insinuates itself into manners and customs, and from these it issues in greater force, and makes its way into mutual compacts, and from compacts it goes on to attack laws and constitutions, displaying the utmost impudence, until it ends by overturning everything, both in public and in private. And as in his Republic he had defined the character of the poetry that should be admitted into his ideal state, so in the Laws he specially defines the character of the melodies and dances, regarding them as the most important factor in determining and preserving the manners and institutions of the citizens. Nothing at first sight to a modern mind could be stranger than this point of view. That poetry has a bearing on conduct we can indeed understand, though we do not make poetry the centre of our system of education. But that moral effects should be attributed to music and to dancing, and that these should be regarded as of such importance as to influence profoundly the whole constitution of a state, will appear to the majority of modern men an unintelligible paradox. Yet no opinion of the Greeks is more profoundly characteristic than this of their whole way of regarding life, and none would better repay a careful study. That moral character should be attributed to the influence of music is only one, and perhaps the most striking, illustration of that general identification by the Greeks of the ethical and the aesthetic standards on which we have so frequently had occasion to insist. Virtue, in their conception, was not a hard conformity to a law felt as alien to the natural character. It was the free expression of a beautiful and harmonious soul. And this very metaphor, harmonious,
which they so constantly employ, involves the idea of a close connection between music and morals. Character, in the Greek view, is a certain proportion of the various elements of the soul, and the right character is the right proportion. But the relation in which these elements stand to one another could be directly affected, it was found, by means of music. Not only could the different emotions be excited or assuaged in various degrees, but the whole relation of the emotional to the rational element could be regulated and controlled by the appropriate melody and measure. That this connection between music and morals really does exist is recognized in a rough and general way by most people who have any musical sense. There are rhythms and tunes, for example, that are felt to be vulgar and base, and others that are felt to be ennobling. Some music, Wagner's for instance, is frequently called immoral. Gounod is described as enervating, Beethoven as bracing, and the like. And however absurd such comments may often appear to be in detail, underlying them is the undoubtedly well-grounded sense that various kinds of music have various ethical qualities. But it is just this side of music which has been neglected in modern times that was the one on which the Greeks laid most stress. Infinitely inferior to the moderns in the mechanical resources of the art, they had made, it appears, a far finer and closer analysis of its relation to emotional states, with the result that even in music, which we describe as the purest of the arts, congratulating ourselves on its absolute dissociation from all definite intellectual conceptions, even here the standard of the Greeks was as much ethical as aesthetic, and the style of music was distinguished and its value appraised, not only by the pleasure to be derived from it, but also by the effect it tended to produce on character. Of this position we have a clear and definite statement in Aristotle. Virtue, he says, consists in loving and hating in the proper way, and implies therefore a delight in the proper emotions. But emotions of any kind are produced by melody and rhythm. Therefore, by music a man becomes accustomed to feeling the right emotions. Music has thus the power to form character, and the various kinds of music, based on the various modes, may be distinguished by their effects on character. One, for example, working in the direction of melancholy, another of effeminacy, one encouraging abandonment, another self-control, another enthusiasm, and so on through the series. It follows that music may be judged not merely by the pleasure it gives, but by the character of its moral influence. Pleasure indeed is essential, or there would be no art. But the different kinds of pleasure given by different kinds of music are to be distinguished not merely by quantity, but by quality. One will produce a right pleasure of which the good man will approve, and which will have a good effect on character. Another will be in exactly the opposite case. Or, as Plato puts it, the excellence of music is to be measured by pleasure, but the pleasure must not be that of chance persons. The fairest music is that which delights the best and best educated, and especially that which delights the one man who is preeminent in virtue and education. We see then that even pure music to the Greeks had a distinct and definite ethical bearing. But this ethical influence was further emphasised by the fact that it was not their custom to enjoy their music pure. What they called music, as has been already pointed out, was an intimate union of melody, verse, and dance, so that the particular emotional meaning of the rhythm and tune employed was brought out into perfect lucidity by the accompanying words and gestures. Thus we find, for example, that Plato characterises a tendency in his own time to the separation of melody and verse, as a sign of a want of true artistic taste. For, he says, it is very hard, in the absence of words, to distinguish the exact character of the mood which the rhythm and tune is supposed to represent. In this connection, it may be interesting to refer to the use of leitmotif in modern music. Here, too, a particular idea, if not a particular set of words, is associated with a particular musical phrase, the intention of the practice being clearly the same as that which is indicated in the passage just quoted, namely to add precision and definiteness to the vague emotional content of pure music. And this determining effect of words was further enhanced, in the music of the Greeks, by the additional accompaniment of the dance. The emotional character conveyed to the mind by the words, and to the ear by the tune, was further explained to the eye by gesture, pose, and beat of foot. The combination of the three modes of expression forming thus, in the Greek sense, a single imitative art. The dance as well as the melody came thus to have a definite ethical significance. It imitates, says Aristotle, character, emotion, and action. And Plato, in his ideal republic, would regulate by law the dances, no less than the melodies to be employed, distinguishing them too as morally good or morally bad, and encouraging the one while he forbids the other. The general Greek view of music, which has thus been briefly expounded, the union of melody and rhythm with poetry and the dance, in view of a definite and consciously intended ethical character, may be illustrated by the following passage of Plutarch, in which he describes the music in vogue at Sparta. The whole system, it will be observed, is designed with a view to that military courage which was the virtue most prized in the Spartan state, and the one about which all their institutions centred. Music at Sparta actually was what Plato would have had it in his ideal republic, a public and state regulated function. And even that vigorous race, which of all the Greeks came nearest to being Philistines of virtue, thought fit to lay a foundation purely aesthetic for their severe and soldierly ideal. Their instruction in music and verse, says Plutarch, was not less carefully attended to than their habits of grace and good breeding in conversation, and their very songs had a life and spirit in them that inflamed and possessed men's minds with an enthusiasm and ardour for action. The style of them was plain and without affectation, the subject always serious and moral. Most usually it was in praise of such men as had died in defence of their country, or in derision of those that had been cowards. The former they declared happy and glorified; the life of the latter they described as most miserable and abject. There were also vaunts of what they would do, and boasts of what they had done, varying with the various ages. As, for example, they had 3 choirs in their solemn festivals, the first of the old men, the second of the young men, and the last of the children. The old men began thus: "We once were young and brave and strong." The young men answered them, singing, "And we're so now, come on and try." The children came last and said, "But we'll be strongest by and by." Indeed, if we will take the pains to consider their compositions, and the airs on the flute to which they marched when going to battle, we shall find that Terpander and Pindar had reason to say that music and valour were allied. The way of regarding music which is illustrated in this passage, and in all that is said on the subject by Greek writers, is so typical of the whole point of view of the Greeks, that we may be pardoned for insisting once again on the attitude of mind which it implies. Music, as we saw, had an ethical value to the Greeks, but that is not to say that they put the ethics first and the music second, using the one as a mere tool of the other. Rather, an ethical state of mind was also, in their view, a musical one. In a sense something more than metaphorical, virtue was a harmony of the soul. The musical end was thus identical with the ethical one. The most beautiful music was also the morally best, and vice versa. Virtue was not prior to beauty, nor beauty to virtue. They were 2 aspects of the same reality, 2 ways of regarding a single fact, and if aesthetic effects were supposed to be amenable to ethical judgment, it was only because ethical judgments at bottom were aesthetic. The good and the beautiful were one and the same thing. That is the first and last word of the Greek ideal. And while thus, on the one hand, virtue was invested with the spontaneity and delight of art, on the other, art derived from its association with ethics emotional precision. In modern times, the end of music is commonly conceived to be simply and without more ado the excitement of feeling. Its value is measured by the intensity rather than the quality of the emotion which it is capable of arousing, and the auditor abandons himself to a casual succession of highly wrought moods, as bewildering in the actual experience as it is exhausting in the after effects. In Greek music, on the other hand, if we may trust our accounts, while the intensity of the feeling excited must have been far less than that which it is in the power of modern instrumentation to evoke, its character was perfectly simple and definite. Melody, rhythm, gesture, and words were all consciously adapted to the production of a single precisely conceived emotional effect. The listener was in a position clearly to understand and appraise the value of the mood excited in him.
Instead of being exhausted and confused by a chaos of vague and conflicting emotion, he had the sense of relief which accompanies the deliverance of a definite passion, and returned to his ordinary business purged, as they said, and tranquillized, by a process which he understood, directed to an end of which he approved. End of chapter 4, section 4. Recording by Martin Geeson in Haslemere, Surrey. Chapter 4, section 5 of the Greek View of Life by Goldsworthy Lowes Dickinson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Martin Geeson. Chapter 4, section 5. Poetry. If now, as we have seen in the plastic arts, and in an art which appears to us so pure as music, the Greeks perceived and valued, along with the immediate pleasure of beauty, a definite ethical character and bent, much more was this the case with poetry, whose material is conceptions and ideas. The works of the poets, and especially of Homer, were in fact to the Greeks all that moral treatises are to us. Or rather, instead of learning their lessons in abstract terms, they learnt them out of the concrete representation of life. Poetry was the basis of their education, the guide and commentary of their practice, the inspiration of their speculative thought. If they have a proposition to advance, they must back it by a citation. If they have a counsel to offer, they must prop it up with a verse. Not only for delight, but for inspiration, warning, and example, they were steeped from childhood onwards in an ocean of melodious discourse. Their national epics were to them what the Bible was to the Puritans, and for every conjunction of fortune, for every issue of home or state, they found therein a text to prompt or reinforce their decision. Of this importance of poetry in the life of ancient Greece, and generally of the importance of music and art, the following passage from Plato is a striking illustration. When the boy has learned his letters and is beginning to understand what is written, as before he understood only what was spoken, they put into his hands the works of the great poets, which he reads at school. In these are contained many admonitions, and many tales, and praises, and encomia of ancient famous men, which he is required to learn by heart, in order that he may imitate or emulate them, and desire to become like them. Then again, the teachers of the lyre take similar care that their young disciple is temperate and gets into no mischief, and when they have taught him the use of the lyre, they introduce him to the poems of other excellent poets, who are the lyric poets, and these they set to music and make their harmonies and rhythms quite familiar to the children's souls, in order that they may learn to be more gentle and harmonious and rhythmical, and so more fitted for speech and action. For the life of man in every part has need of harmony and rhythm. From this conception of poetry as a storehouse of practical wisdom, the transition is easy to a purely ethical judgment of its value. and that transition, as has already been noted, was actually made by Plato, who even goes so far as to prescribe to poets the direct inculcation of such morals as are proper to a tract, as that the good and just man is happy, even though he be poor, and the bad and unjust man miserable, even though he be rich. This didacticism, no doubt, is a parody, but it is a parody of the normal Greek view, that the excellence of a poem is closely bound up with the compass and depth of its whole ethical content, and is not to be measured, as many moderns maintain, merely by the aesthetic beauty of its form. When Strabo says, "It is impossible to be a good poet unless you are first a good man," he is expressing the common opinion of the Greeks that the poet is to be judged not merely as an artist, but as an interpreter of life. And the same presupposition underlies the remark of Aristotle that poets may be classified according as the characters they represent are as good as, better, or worse than the average man. But perhaps the most remarkable illustration of this way of regarding poetry is the passage in the Frogs of Aristophanes, where the comedian has introduced a controversy between Aeschylus and Euripides as to the relative merit of their works, and has made the decision turn almost entirely on moral considerations, the question being really whether or no Euripides is to be regarded as a corrupter of his countrymen. In the course of the discussion, Aeschylus is made to give expression to a view of poetry which clearly enough Aristophanes endorses himself, and which no doubt would be accepted by the majority of his audience. He appeals to all antiquity to show that poets have always been the instructors of mankind, and that it is for this that they are held in honour. Look to traditional history, look to antiquity, primitive, early, remote. See there what a blessing illustrious poets conferred on mankind in the centuries past. Orpheus instructed mankind in religion, reclaimed them from bloodshed and barbarous rites. Musaeus delivered the doctrine of medicine, and warnings prophetic for ages to come. Next came old Hesiod, teaching us husbandry, ploughing and sowing and rural affairs, rural economy, rural astronomy, homely morality, labour and thrift. Homer himself, our adorable Homer, what was his title to praise and renown? What but the worth of the lessons he taught us? Discipline, arms, and equipment of war. While then there is, as we should naturally expect, plenty of Greek poetry which is simply the spontaneous expression of passionate feeling, unrestrained by the consideration of ethical or other ends, yet, if we take for our type, as we are fairly entitled to do from the prominent place it held in Greek life, not the lyrics but the drama of Greece, we shall find that in poetry, even, as was to be expected, to a higher degree than in music and the plastic arts, the beauty sought and achieved is one that lies within the limits of certain definite moral presuppositions. Let us consider this point in some detail. And first, let us examine the character of Greek tragedy. End of chapter 4, section 5. Recording by Martin Geeson in Haslemere, Surrey. Chapter 4, section 6, part 1 of the Greek View of Life by Goldsworthy Lowes Dickinson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Martin Geeson. Chapter 4, section 6, Tragedy, part 1. The character of Greek tragedy was determined from the very beginning by the fact of its connection with religion. The season at which it was performed was the festival of Dionysus. About his altar the chorus danced, and the object of the performance was the representation of scenes out of the lives of ancient heroes. The subject of the drama was thus strictly prescribed. It must be selected out of a cycle of legends familiar to the audience, and whatever freedom might be allowed to the poet in his treatment of the theme, whatever the reflections he might embroider upon it, the speculative or ethical views, the criticism of contemporary life, all must be subservient to the main object originally proposed, the setting forth, for edification as well as for delight, of some episodes in the lives of those heroes of the past, who were considered not only to be greater than their descendants, but to be the sons of gods, and worthy themselves of worship as divine. By this fundamental condition, the tragedy of the Greeks is distinguished sharply, on the one hand from the Shakespearean drama, on the other from the classical drama of the French. The tragedies of Shakespeare are devoid, one might say, or at least comparatively devoid, of all preconceptions. He was free to choose what subject he liked, and to treat it as he would, and no sense of obligation to religious or other points of view, no feeling for traditions descended from a sacred past and not likely to be handled by those who were their trustees for the future, sobered or restrained, for evil or for good, his half barbaric genius. He flung himself upon life with the irresponsible ardour of the discoverer of a new continent, shaped and reshaped it as he chose, carved from it now the cynicism of Measure for Measure, now the despair of Hamlet and of Lear, now the radiant magnanimity of the Tempest, and departed, leaving behind him not a map or chart, but a series of mutually incompatible landscapes. What Shakespeare gave, in short, was a many-sided representation of life. What the Greek dramatist gave was an interpretation, but an interpretation not simply personal to himself, but representative of the national tradition and belief. The men whose deeds and passions he narrated were the patterns and examples on the one hand, on the other the warnings of his race. The gods who determined the fortunes they sang were working still among men. The moral laws that ruled the past ruled the present too, and the history of the Hellenic race moved under a visible providence from its divine origin onward to an end that would be prosperous or the reverse,
according as later generations should continue to observe the worship and traditions of their fathers, descended from heroes and gods. And it is the fact that in this sense it was representative of the national consciousness that distinguishes the Greek tragedy from the classical drama of the French. For the latter, though it imitated the ancients in outward form, was inspired with a totally different spirit. The kings and heroes whose fortunes it narrated were not the ancestors of the French race. They had no root in its affections, no connection with its religious beliefs, no relation to its ethical conceptions. The whole ideal set forth was not that which really inspired the nation, but at best that which was supposed to inspire the court. And the whole drama, like a tree transplanted to an alien soil, withers and dies for lack of the nourishment which the tragedy of the Greeks unconsciously imbibed from its encompassing air of national tradition. Such then was the general character of the Greek tragedy, an interpretation of the national ideal. Let us now proceed to follow out some of the consequences involved in this conception. In the first place, the theme represented is the life and fate of ancient heroes, of personages, that is to say, greater than ordinary men, both for good and for evil, in their qualities and in their achievements, pregnant with fateful issues, makers or marrers of the fortunes of the world. Tragic and terrible their destiny may be, but never contemptible or squalid. Behind all suffering, behind sin and crime, must lie a redeeming magnanimity. A complete villain, says Aristotle, is not a tragic character, for he has no hold upon the sympathies. If he prosper, it is an outrage on common human feeling. If he fall into disaster, it is merely what he deserves. Neither is it admissible to represent the misfortunes of a thoroughly good man, for that is merely painful and distressing. And least of all is it tolerable gratuitously to introduce mere baseness, or madness, or other aberrations from human nature. The true tragic hero is a man of high place and birth, who, having a nature not ignoble, has fallen into sin and pays in suffering the penalty of his act. Nothing could throw more light on the distinguishing characteristics of the Greek drama than these few remarks of Aristotle, and nothing could better indicate how close in the Greek mind was the connection between aesthetic and ethical judgments. The canon of Aristotle would exclude as proper themes for tragedy the character and fate, say, of Richard III, the absolutely bad man suffering his appropriate desert, or of Kent and Cordelia, the absolutely good brought into unmerited affliction, and that not merely because such themes offend the moral sense, but because, by so offending, they destroy the proper pleasure of the tragic art. The whole aesthetic effect is limited by ethical presuppositions, and to outrage these is to defeat the very purpose of tragedy.
Specially interesting in this connection are the strictures passed on Euripides in the passage of the Frogs of Aristophanes, to which allusion has already been made. Euripides is there accused of lowering the tragic art by introducing what? Women in love, the central theme of modern tragedy. It is the boast of Aeschylus that there is not one of his plays which touches on this subject. I never allowed of your lewd Sthenoboias, or filthy detestable Phaedras. Not I. Indeed, I should doubt if my drama throughout exhibit an instance of woman in love. And there can be little doubt that with a Greek audience this would count to him as a merit, and that the shifting of the centre of interest by Euripides from the sterner passions of heroes and of kings to this tenderer phase of human feeling would be felt, even by those whom it charmed, to be a declension from the height of the older tragedy. And to this limitation of subject corresponds a limitation of treatment. The Greek tragedy is composed from a definite point of view, with the aim not merely to represent, but also to interpret the theme. Underlying the whole construction of the plot, the dialogue, the reflections, the lyric interludes, is the intention to illustrate some general moral law, some common and typical problem, some fundamental truth. Of the elder dramatists, at any rate, Aeschylus and Sophocles, one may even say that it was their purpose, however imperfectly achieved, to justify the ways of God to man. To represent suffering as the punishment of sin is the constant bent of Aeschylus. To justify the law of God against the presumption of man is the central idea of Sophocles. In either case, the whole tone is essentially religious. To choose such a theme as Lear, to treat it as Shakespeare has treated it, to leave it, as it were, bleeding from 1,000 wounds, in mute and helpless entreaty for the healing that is never to be vouchsafed, this would have been repulsive, if not impossible, to a Greek tragedian. Without ever descending from concrete art to the abstractions of mere moralising, without ever attempting to substitute a verbal formula for the full and complex perception that grows out of a representation of life, the ancient dramatists were nevertheless, in the whole apprehension of their theme, determined by a more or less conscious speculative bias. The world, to them, was not merely a splendid chaos, it was a divine plan, and even in its darkest hollows, its passes most perilous and bleak, they have their hand, though doubtful perhaps and faltering, upon the clue that is to lead them up to the open sky. It is consonant with this account of the nature of Greek tragedy that it should have laid more stress upon action than upon character. The interest was centred on the universal bearing of certain acts and situations, on the light which the experience represented threw on the whole tendency and course of human life, not on the sentiments and motives of the particular personages introduced.
The characters are broad and simple, not developing for the most part, but fixed, and fitted therefore to be the mediums of direct action, of simple issues, and typical situations. In the Greek tragedy, the general point of view predominates over the idiosyncrasies of particular persons. It is human nature that is represented in the broad, not this or that highly specialized variation. And what we have indicated as the general aim, the interpretation of life, is never obscured by the predominance of exceptional and, so to speak, accidental characteristics. Man is the subject of the Greek drama. The subject of the modern novel is Tom and Dick. Finally, to the realization of this general aim, the whole form of the Greek drama was admirably adapted. It consisted very largely of conversations between two persons, representing two opposed points of view, and giving occasion for an almost scientific discussion of every problem of action raised in the play. And between these conversations were inserted lyric odes in which the chorus commented on the situation, bestowed advice or warning, praise or blame, and finally summed up the moral of the whole. Through the chorus, in fact, the poet could speak in his own person, and impose upon the whole tragedy any tone which he desired. Periodically he could drop the dramatist and assume the preacher, and thus ensure that his play should be what we have seen was its recognized ideal, not merely a representation, but an interpretation of life. But this without ceasing to be a work of art. In attempting to analyze in abstract terms the general character of the Greek tragedy, we have necessarily thrown into the shade what after all was its primary and most essential aspect. An aspect, however, of which a full appreciation could only be attained not by a mere perusal of the text, but by what is, unfortunately, forever beyond our power, the witnessing of an actual representation as it was given on the Greek stage. For, from a purely aesthetic point of view, the Greek drama must be reckoned among the most perfect of art forms. End of chapter 4, section 6, part 1. Recording by Martin Geeson in Haslemere, Surrey. Chapter 4, section 6, part 2 of The Greek View of Life by Goldsworthy Lowes Dickinson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Martin Geeson. Chapter 4, section 6. Tragedy, part 2. Taking place in the open air, on the sunny slope of a hill, valley and plain or islanded sea stretching away below to meet the blazing blue of a cloudless sky, the moving pageant, thus from the first set in tune with nature, brought to a focus of splendour the rays of every separate art. More akin to an opera than to a play, it had as its basis music. For the drama had developed out of the lyric ode, and retained throughout what was at first its only element,
the dance and song of a mimetic chorus. By this centre of rhythmic motion and pregnant melody, the burden of the tale was caught up and echoed again, as the living globe divided into spheres of answering song. The clear and precise significance of the plot, never obscure to the head, being thus brought home in music to the passion of the heart, the idea embodied in lyric verse, the verse transfigured by song, and song and verse reflected as in a mirror to the eye by the swing and beat of the limbs they stirred to consonance of motion. And while such was the character of the odes that broke the action of the play, the action itself was an appeal not less to the ear and to the eye than to the passion and the intellect. The circumstances of the representation, the huge auditorium in the open air, lent themselves less to acting in our sense of the term than to attitude and declamation. The actors, raised on high boots above their natural height, their faces hidden in masks, and their tones mechanically magnified, must have relied for their effects not upon facial play or rapid and subtle variations of voice and gesture, but upon a certain statuesque beauty of pose, and a chanting intonation of that majestic iambic verse, whose measure would have been obscured by a rapid and conversational delivery. The representation would thus become moving sculpture to the eye, and to the ear as it were a sleep of music between the intenser interludes of the chorus, and the spectator, without being drawn away by an imitative realism from the calm of impassioned contemplation into the fever and fret of a veritable actor on the scene, received an impression based throughout on that clear intellectual foundation, that almost prosaic lucidity of sentiment and plot, which is preserved to us in the written text, but raised by the accompanying appeal to the sense, made, as it must have been made by such artists as the Greeks, by the grouping of forms and colour, the recitative, the dance, and the song, to such a greatness and height of aesthetic significance as can hardly have been realised by any other form of art production. The nearest modern analogy to what the ancient drama must have been is to be found probably in the operas of Wagner, who indeed was strongly influenced by the tragedy of the Greeks. It was his ideal, like theirs, to combine the various branches of art, employing not only music, but poetry, sculpture, painting, and the dance, for the representation of his dramatic theme, and his conception also to make art the interpreter of life, reflecting in a national drama the national consciousness, the highest action and the deepest passion and thought of the German race. To consider how far in this attempt he falls short of or goes beyond the achievement of the Greeks, and to examine the wide dissimilarities that underlie the general identity of aim, would be to wander too far afield from our present theme. But the comparison may be recommended to those who are anxious to form a concrete idea of what the effect of a Greek tragedy may have been.
and to clothe in imagination the dead bones of the literary text with the flesh and blood of a representation to the sense. Meantime, to assist the reader to realize with somewhat greater precision the bearing of the foregoing remarks, it may be worth while to give an outline sketch of one of the most celebrated of the Greek tragedies, the Agamemnon of Aeschylus. The hero of the drama belongs to that heroic house whose tragic history was among the most terrible and the most familiar to a Greek audience. Tantalus, the founder of the family, for some offence against the gods, was suffering in Hades the punishment which is christened by his name. His son Pelops was stained with the blood of Myrtilus. Of the two sons of the next generation, Thyestes seduced the wife of his brother Atreus, and Atreus in return killed the sons of Thyestes and made the father unwittingly eat the flesh of the murdered boys. Agamemnon, son of Atreus, to propitiate Artemis, sacrificed his daughter Iphigenia, and in revenge was murdered by Clytemnestra his wife. And Clytemnestra was killed by Orestes her son, in atonement for the death of Agamemnon. For generations the race had been dogged by crime and punishment, and in choosing for his theme the murder of Agamemnon, the dramatist could assume in his audience so close a familiarity with the past history of the house, that he could call into existence by an elusive word that sombre background of woe to enhance the terrors of his actual presentation. The figures he brought into vivid relief joined hands with menacing forms that faded away into the night of the future and the past, while above them hung, intoning doom, the phantom host of Furies. Yet at the outset of the drama all promises well. The watchman on the roof of the palace, in the 10th year of his watch, catches sight at last of the signal fire that announces the capture of Troy and the speedy return of Agamemnon. With joy he proclaims to the house the long-delayed and welcome news. Yet even in the moment of exultation lets slip a doubtful phrase, hinting at something behind, which he dares not name, something which may turn to despair the triumph of victory. Hereupon enter the chorus of Argive elders, chanting as they move to the measure of a stately march. They sing how 10 years before Agamemnon and Menelaus had led forth the host of Greece, at the bidding of the Zeus who protects hospitality, to recover for Menelaus Helen his wife, treacherously stolen by Paris. Then, as they take their places and begin their rhythmic dance, in a strain of impassioned verse that is at once a narrative and a lyric hymn, they tell, or rather present, in a series of vivid images, flashing as by illumination of lightning out of a night of veiled and sombre boding, the tale of the deed that darkened the starting of the host, the sacrifice of Iphigenia to the goddess whose wrath was delaying the fleet at Aulis.
In verse, in music, in pantomime, the scene lives again. The struggle in the father's heart, the insistence of his brother chiefs, the piteous glance of the girl, and at last the unutterable end, while above and through it all rings like a knell of fate the refrain that is the motive of the whole drama. Sing woe, but may the good prevail. At the conclusion of the ode enters Clytemnestra. She makes a formal announcement to the chorus of the fall of Troy, describes the course of the signal fire from beacon to beacon as it sped, and pictures in imagination the scenes even then taking place in the doomed city. On her withdrawal, the chorus break once more into song and dance. To the music of a solemn hymn, they point the moral of the fall of Troy, the certain doom of violence and fraud descended upon Paris and his house. Once more the vivid pictures flash from the night of woe. Helen in her fatal beauty stepping lightly to her doom, the widowers' nights of mourning haunted by the ghost of love, the horrors of the war that followed, the slain abroad and the mourners at home, the change of living flesh and blood for the dust and ashes of the tomb. At last, with a return to their original theme, the doom of insolence, the chorus close their ode and announce the arrival of a messenger from Troy. Talthybius, the herald, enters as spokesman of the army and king, describing the hardships they have suffered and the joy of the triumphant issue. To him Clytemnestra announces, in words of which the irony is patent to the audience, her sufferings in the absence of her husband, and her delight at the prospect of his return. He will find her, she says, as he left her, a faithful watcher of the home, her loyalty sure, her honour undefiled. Then follows another choral ode, similar in theme to the last, dwelling on the woe brought by the act of Paris upon Troy, the change of the bridal song to the trump of war and the dirge of death, contrasting in a profusion of splendid tropes the beauty of Helen with the curse to which it is bound, and insisting once more on the doom that attends insolence and pride. At the conclusion of this song, the measure changes to a march, and the chorus turn to welcome the triumphant king. Agamemnon enters, and behind him the veiled and silent figure of a woman. After greeting the gods of his house, the king, in brief and stilted phrase, acknowledges the loyalty of the chorus, but hints at much that is amiss, which it must be his first charge to set right. Hereupon enters Clytemnestra, and in a speech of rhetorical exaggeration tells of her anxious waiting for her lord, and her inexpressible joy at his return. In conclusion, she directs that purple cloth be spread upon his path, that he may enter the house as befits a conqueror. After a show of resistance, Agamemnon yields the point, and the contrast at which the dramatist aims is achieved. With the pomp of an Eastern monarch, always repellent to the Greek mind, the king steps across the threshold, steps, as the audience knows, to his death. The higher the reach of his power and pride, the more terrible and swift is the nemesis. And Clytemnestra follows in triumph with the enigmatic cry upon her lips: "Zeus, who art god of fulfilment, fulfill my prayers." As she withdraws, the chorus begin a song of boding fear, the more terrible that it is still indefinite. Something is going to happen, the presentiment is sure. But what? But what? They search the night in vain. Meantime, motionless and silent, waits the figure of the veiled woman. It is Cassandra, the prophetess, daughter of Priam of Troy, whom Agamemnon has carried home as his prize. Clytemnestra returns to urge her to enter the house. She makes no sign and utters no word. The queen changes her tone from courtesy to anger and rebuke. The figure neither stirs nor speaks, and Clytemnestra at last, with an angry threat, leaves her and returns to the palace. Then, and not till then, a cry breaks from the stranger's lips, a passionate cry to Apollo, who gave her her fatal gift. All the sombre history of the house to which she has been brought, the woe that has been, and the woe that is to come, passes in pictures across her inner sense. In a series of broken ejaculations, not sentences, but lyric cries, she evokes the scenes of the past and of the future. Blood drips from the palace. In its chambers the Furies crouch. The murdered sons of Thyestes wail in its haunted courts, and ever among the visions of the past, that one of the future floats and fades, clearly discerned, impossible to avert, the murder of a husband by a wife. And in the rear of that, most pitiful of all, the violent death of the seer, who sees in vain and may not help. Between Cassandra and the chorus, it is a duet of anguish and fear. In the broken lyric phrases, a phantom music wails, till at last, at what seems the breaking point, the tension is relaxed, and dropping into the calmer iambic recitative, Cassandra tells her message in plainer speech, and clearly proclaims the murder of the king. Then, with a last appeal to the avenger that is to come, she enters the palace alone to meet her death. The stage is empty. Suddenly a cry is heard from within, again, and then again. While the chorus hesitate, the deed is done. The doors are thrown open, and Clytemnestra is seen standing over the corpses of her victims. All disguise is now thrown off. The murderess avows and triumphs in her deed. she justifies it as vengeance for the sacrifice of Iphigenia, and sees in herself not a free human agent, but the incarnate curse of the house of Tantalus. And now for the first time appears the adulterer Aegisthus, who has planned the whole behind the scenes. He too is an avenger, for he is the son of that Thyestes who was made to feed on his own children's flesh. The murder of Agamemnon is but one more link in the long chain of hereditary guilt. And with that exposition of the pitiless law of punishment and crime, this chapter of the great drama comes to a close. But the Agamemnon is only the first of a series of 3 plays, closely connected and meant to be performed in succession. And the problem raised in the first of them, the crime that cries for punishment, and the punishment that is itself a new crime, is solved in the last by a reconciliation of the powers of heaven and hell, and the pardon of the last offender in the person of Orestes. To sketch, however, the plan of the other dramas of the trilogy would be to trespass too far upon our space and time. It is enough to have illustrated, by the example of the Agamemnon, the general character of a Greek tragedy, and those who care to pursue the subject further must be referred to the text of the plays themselves. End of chapter 4, section 6. Recording by Martin Geeson in Haslemere, Surrey. Chapter 4, section 7 of the Greek View of Life by Goldsworthy Lowes Dickinson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Martin Geeson. Chapter 4, section 7. Comedy. Even more remarkable than the tragedy of the Greeks, in its rendering of a didactic intention under the forms of a free and spontaneous art, is the older comedy known to us through the works of Aristophanes. As the former dealt with the general conceptions, religious and ethical, that underlay the Greek view of life, using as its medium of exposition the ancient national myths, so the latter dealt with the particular phases of contemporary life, employing the machinery of a free burlesque. The achievement of Aristophanes, in fact, is more astonishing in a sense than that of Aeschylus. Starting with what is always, prima facie, the prose of everyday life, its acrid controversies, its vulgar and tedious types, and even its particular individuals, for Aristophanes does not hesitate to introduce his contemporaries in person on the stage. He fits to this gross and heavy stuff the wings of imagination, scatters from it the clinging mists of banality and spite, and speeds it forth through the lucid heaven of art, amid peals of musical laughter and snatches of lyric song. For Aristophanes was a poet as well as a comedian, and his genius is displayed not only in the construction of his fantastic plots, not only in the inexhaustible profusion of his humane and genial wit, but in bursts of pure poetry as melodious and inspired as ever sprang from the lips of the lyrists of Greece or of the world. The basis of the comic, as of the tragic art of the Greeks, was song and dance, and the chorus, the original element of the play, still retains in the works of Aristophanes a place important enough to make it clear that in comedy too a prominent aspect of the art must have been the aesthetic appeal to the ear and the eye. In general structure, in fact, comedy and tragedy were alike. Aesthetically the motives were similar, only they were set in a different key. But while primarily Aristophanes, like the tragedians, was a great artist, he was also, like them, a great interpreter of life. His dramas are satires as well as poems, and he was, and expressed himself, supremely conscious of having a mission to fulfill. He has scorned from the first, he makes the chorus sing of himself in the piece. He has scorned from the first to descend and to dip, peddling and meddling in private affairs, to detect and collect every petty defect of husband and wife and domestical life, but intrepid and bold, like Alcides of old, when the rest stood aloof, put himself to the proof in his country's behoof. His aim, in fact, was deliberately to instruct his countrymen in political and social issues, to attack the abuses of the assembly, of the law courts and the home, to punish demagogues, charlatans, professional politicians, to laugh back into their senses revolting sons and wives, to defend the orthodox faith against philosophers and men of science. These are the themes that he embodies in his plots, and these the morals that he enforces when he speaks through the chorus in his own person. And the result is an art product more strange to the modern mind in its union of poetry with prose, of aesthetic with didactic significance, than even that marvellous creation, the Greek tragedy. Of the character of this comedy, the reader may form an idea through the admirable and easily accessible translations of Freer, and we are therefore dispensed from the obligation to attempt, as in the case of tragedy, an account of some particular specimen of the art. End of chapter 4, section 7. Recording by Martin Geeson in Haslemere, Surrey. Chapter 4, section 8 of the Greek View of Life by Goldsworthy Lowes Dickinson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Martin Geeson. Chapter 4, section 8. Summary. And here must conclude our survey of the character of Greek art. The main point which we have endeavoured to make clear has been so often insisted upon that it is hardly necessary to dwell upon it further. The key to the art of the Greeks, as well as to their ethics, is the identification of the beautiful and the good, and it therefore is as natural in treating of their art to insist on its ethical value as it was to insist on the aesthetic significance of their moral ideal. but in fact any insistence on either side of the judgment is misleading. The 2 points of view had never been dissociated, and art and conduct alike proceeded from the same imperative impulse to create a harmony or order which was conceived indifferently as beautiful or good. Through and through, the Greek ideal is unity, to make the individual at one with the state, the real with the ideal, the inner with the outer, art with morals, finally to bring all phases of life under the empire of a single idea, which with Goethe we may call, as we will, the good, the beautiful, or the whole. This was the aim, and to a great extent the achievement of their genius. And of all the points of view from which we may envisage their brilliant activity, none perhaps is more central and more characteristic than this of art, whose essence is the comprehension of the many in the one, and the perfect reflection of the inner in the outer. End of chapter 4. The Greek View of Art. Recording by Martin Geeson in Haslemere, Surrey. Chapter 5 of The Greek View of Life by Goldsworthy Lowes Dickinson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Martin Geeson. Chapter 5. Conclusion. Now that we have examined in some detail the most important phases of the Greek view of life, it may be as well to endeavour briefly to recapitulate and bring to a point the various considerations that have been advanced. But first, one preliminary remark must be made. Throughout the preceding pages, we have made no attempt to distinguish the Greek view from the Greek ideal. We have interpreted their customs and institutions, political, social, or religious, by the conceptions and ideals of philosophers and poets, and have thus, it may be objected, made the mistake of identifying the blind work of popular instinct with the theories and aspirations of conscious thought. Such a procedure, no doubt, would be illegitimate if it were supposed to imply that Greek institutions were the result of a deliberate intention consciously adopted and approved by the average man. Like other social products, they grew and were not made, and it was only the few who realised fully all that they implied. But on the other hand, it is a distinguishing characteristic of the Greek age that the ideal formulated by thought was the direct outcome of the facts. That absolute separation of what ought to be from what is, which continues to haunt and vitiate modern life, had not yet been made in ancient Greece. Plato, idealist though he be, is yet rooted in the facts of his age. His perfect republic he bases on the institutions of Sparta and Crete. His perfect man he shapes on the lines of the Greek citizen. That dislocation of the spirit which opposed the body to the soul, heaven to earth, the church to the state, the man of the world to the priest, was altogether alien to the consciousness of the Greeks.
To them, the world of fact was also the world of the ideal. The conceptions which inspired their highest aims were already embodied in their institutions and reflected in their life, and the realisation of what ought to be involved not the destruction of what was, but merely its perfecting on its own lines. While then, on the one hand, it would be ridiculous so to idealise the civilisation of the Greeks as to imply that they had eliminated discord and confusion, yet, on the other, it is legitimate to say that they had built on the plan of the ideal, and that their life, both in public and private, was, by the very law of its existence, an effort to realise explicitly that type of good which was already implicitly embodied in its structure. The ideal, in a word, in ancient Greece was organically related to the real, and that is why it is possible to identify the Greek view with the Greek ideal. Bearing this in mind, we may now proceed to recapitulate our conclusions as to what that view was. And first, let us take the side of speculation. Here we are concerned not with the formal systems of Greek thought, but with that half unconscious working of imagination as much as of mind, whose expression was their popular religion. Of this religion, as we saw, the essential feature was that belief in anthropomorphic gods, by virtue of which a reconciliation was effected between man and the powers, whether of nature or of his own soul. Behind phenomena, physical or psychic, beings were conceived, of like nature with man. Beings, therefore, whose actions he could interpret and whose motives he could comprehend. For his imagination, if not for his intellect, a harmony was thus induced between himself and the world that was not he. A harmony, and in this word we have the key to the dominant idea of the Greek civilisation. For turning now to the practical side, we find the same impulse to reconcile divergent elements. That antithesis of soul and body which was emphasised in the medieval view of life, and dominates still our current ethical conceptions, does not appear in the normal consciousness of the Greeks. Their ideal for the individual life included the perfection of the body. Beauty, no less than goodness, was the object of their quest, and they believed that the one implied the other. But since the perfection of the body required the cooperation of external aids, they made these also essential to their ideal. Not merely virtue of the soul, not merely health and beauty of the body, but noble birth, sufficient wealth, and a good name among men were included in their conception of the desirable life. Harmony, in a word, was the end they pursued. Harmony of the soul with the body, and of the body with its environment. And it is this that distinguishes their ethical ideal from that which in later times has insisted on the fundamental antagonism of the inner to the outer life, and made the perfection of the spirit depend on the mortification of the flesh. The same ideal of harmony dominates the Greek view of the relation of the individual to the state.
This relation, it is true, is often described as one in which the parts were subordinated to the whole. But more accurately, it may be said that they were conceived as finding in the whole their realisation. The perfect individual was the individual in the state. The faculties essential to his excellence had there only their opportunity of development. The qualities defined as virtues had there only their significance. And it was only in so far as he was a citizen that a man was properly a man at all. Thus, that opposition between the individual and the state which perplexes our own society had hardly begun to define itself in Greece. If on the one hand the state made larger claims on the liberty of the individual, on the other, the liberty of the individual consisted in a response to the claims. So that in this department also, harmony was maintained by the Greeks between elements which have developed in modern times their latent antagonism. Thus, both in speculation and in practice, in his relation to nature and in his relation to the state, both internally, between the divergent elements of which his own being was composed, and externally, between himself and the world that was not he, it was the aim, conscious or unconscious, and in part at least the achievement of the Greeks, to create and maintain an essential harmony. The antitheses of which we in our own time are so painfully and increasingly aware, between man as a moral being and nature as an indifferent law, between the flesh and the spirit, between the individual and the state, do not appear as factors in that dominant consciousness of the Greeks, under whose influence their religion, their institutions, and their customary ideals had been formed. And so regarded, in general, under what may fairly be called its most essential aspect, the Greek civilization is rightly described as that of harmony. But on the other hand, and this is the point to which we must now turn our attention, this harmony, which was the dominant feature in the consciousness of the Greeks, and the distinguishing characteristic of their epoch in the history of the world, was, nevertheless, after all, but a transitory and imperfect attempt to reconcile elements whose antagonism was too strong for the solution thus proposed. The factors of disruption were present from the beginning in the Greek ideal, and it was as much by the development of its own internal contradictions as by the invasion of forces from without that that fabric of magical beauty was destined to fall. These contradictions have already been indicated at various points in the text, and it only remains to bring them together in a concluding summary. On the side of speculation, the religion of the Greeks was open, as we saw, to a double criticism. On the one hand, the ethical conceptions embodied in those legends of the gods, which were the product of an earlier and more barbarous age, had become to the contemporaries of Plato revolting or ridiculous. On the other hand, to metaphysical speculation, not only was the existence of the gods unproved, but their mutually conflicting activities, their passions and their caprice, were incompatible with that conception of universal law which the developing reason evolved as the form of truth. The reconciliation of man with nature, which had been effected by the medium of anthropomorphic gods, was a harmony only to the imagination, not to the mind. Under the action of the intellect, the unstable combination was dissolved, and the elements that had been thus imperfectly joined fell back into their original opposition. The religion of the Greeks was destroyed by the internal evolution of their own consciousness. And in the sphere of practice we are met with a similar dissolution. The Greek conception of excellence included, as we saw, not only bodily health and strength, but such a share at least of external goods as would give a man scope for his own self-perfection. And since these conditions were not attainable by all, the sacrifice of the majority to the minority was frankly accepted, and the pursuit of the ideal confined to a privileged class. Such a conception, however, was involved in internal contradictions, for in the first place, even for the privileged few, an excellence which depended on external aids was at the best uncertain and problematical. Misfortune and disease were possibilities that could not be ignored. Old age and death were imperative certainties, and no care, no art, no organisation of society could obviate the inherent incompatibility of individual perfection with the course of nature. Harmony between the individual and his environment was perhaps more nearly achieved by and for the aristocracy of ancient Greece than by any society of any other age. But such a harmony, even at the best, is fleeting and precarious, and no perfection of life delivers from death. And in the second place, to secure even this imperfect realisation, it was necessary to restrict the universal application of the ideal. Excellence in Greece was made the end for some, not for all. But this limitation was felt in the development of consciousness to be self-contradictory, and the next great system of ethics that succeeded to those of Aristotle postulated an end of action that should be at once independent of the aids of fortune and open alike to all classes of mankind. The ethics of a privileged class were thus expanded into the ethics of humanity. But this expansion was fatal to its essence, which had depended on the very limitations by which it was destroyed. With the Greek civilization, beauty perished from the world. Never again has it been possible for man to believe that harmony is in fact the truth of all existence. The intellect and the moral sense have developed imperative claims which can be satisfied by no experience known to man. And as a consequence of this, the goal of desire which the Greeks could place in the present has been transferred for us to a future infinitely remote, which nevertheless is conceived as attainable. Dissatisfaction with the world in which we live,
and determination to realize one that shall be better, are the prevailing characteristics of the modern spirit. The development is one into whose meaning and end this is not the place to enter. It is enough that we feel it to be inevitable, that the harmony of the Greeks contained in itself the factors of its own destruction, and that in spite of the fascination which constantly fixes our gaze on that fairest and happiest halting place in the secular march of man, it was not there, any more than here, that he was destined to find the repose of that ultimate reconciliation, which was but imperfectly anticipated by the Greeks. End of chapter 5. Conclusion. Recording by Martin Geeson in Haslemere, Surrey. End of The Greek View of Life by Goldsworthy Lowes Dickinson.